Hi guys, Kim here, design team member with Swirlydoos Kit Club. What I've got for you today is a tutorial using some molds. We were just at CHA in January and we saw a lot of molds. They're coming back in a big way. A lot of big name companies are coming out with some molds. So what I want to do is take you through a tutorial using your molds using different types of mediums. We all know you can use air dry clay for your molds, but I've got some new mediums to use in your molds. We've got some molds here from Martha Stewart that we got in a previous kit. We've got a heart and a cameo. And I've also got a mold here that we got in another kit. This is by Mod Podge. These are a little smaller. And we're going to use some different mediums. This butterfly was made using beeswax. So that was a little different. And this heart was made using some ultra thick embossing enamel. And then this other heart was made using just regular embossing powder. So I'm going to take you through these techniques and then I'm going to show you how I decorated them or altered them afterwards. And then that little frame was made using air dry clay. So we got all our material out here. And we're also going to talk about using the ultra thick embossing enamel in the melting pot. Now, ultra thick embossing enamel comes in several different colors. I used clear, but we've also got some interference blue, which is, this blue is like a iridescent blue. I've also got some gold. And we've also got some bronze. So you can always use different colors. And I've also got the jar of beeswax. This comes in little beads. And we got some red embossing powder. So these are all the supplies that we're going to use. And first we're going to take our heart mold and the red embossing powder. That's what we're going to use first. But what you want to do with your mold is you want to take some cornstarch or some powder or something and you just want to brush a little bit into your mold. This is going to help you get a good release and you only need a little bit. So I brushed that in there and my little brush loses the bristles, so I just brush some bristles out because I don't want those bristles to get into my mold. So now I'm just going to brush, dump some embossing enamel in there. And you want to give it a good tap to make sure it spreads out evenly. And remember, this is going to shrink down, so you want to fill this all the way up to the top. So I'm going to dump some more in there. I had a little chunk we want to get out. And you want to grab some tweezers because it's going to take you a little bit to heat this. And you want to heat it from below. Don't worry about your mold. Because these can take some heat. So you're going to heat that from below because if you try and heat it from above, it's going to blow your embossing powder. So you're going to heat this from below and it's going to take a little bit of time because you've got to heat it from the bottom and it's going to melt up. You'll notice that your embossing powder is going to start to sink down. That's how you're going to know that it's starting to melt, and eventually you'll see that it's starting to melt on top. Once it starts to form together, and I'm sorry, I got off screen, but once it starts to form together and it's just about melted, then you'll be able to use your heat gun on top to go ahead and melt the rest. As you can see, it's starting to get a little bit darker around the edges. That means it's starting to melt. And so I'm just going to keep on melting, and as you see, it's melting. Now I brought my heat gun to the top. And I've completely melted it. Now you want to sit that someplace even so that can go ahead and cool and harden. So I'm just going to sit it on top of my embossing enamel for right now. And next we're going to move on to using some beeswax. The thing with the beeswax is you can kind of push this or mold this into your mold, into the shape of your mold. So you're just going to take the beads and you're going to drop it in there. You want to make sure that you fill this. It's better to overfill it than to underfill it. But the thing about using the beeswax is you can constantly remelt this. So I'm just pushing these beads in to kind of shape the butterfly a little bit here. And I want to make sure I get it into the corners. And my heat tool is kind of powerful, so once this starts to melt, it's going to blow a little bit out, but we'll be able to clean that up. And the beeswax dries really quick. So now I'm going to melt this, and you want to try and get an even melt on this as best you can. But like I said, my heat tool kind of blows things around. As you can see, it's already blowing stuff around. And it doesn't take long for this beeswax to melt. So we're just going to melt that, and you may get an air bubble or two. Just keep melting, or have a straight pin handy so you can just pop that air bubble. All right, so now it's all melted, and I did get some spillage on the side, so I'm just going to take my craft knife and we're just going to clean that up off the edges. It comes off really easy, and I'm going to have a great impression of that. Next up, this is an example that I made for using the ultra thick embossing enamel, and I used it in the melting pot. It's a lot easier to do it that way. You can use ultra thick embossing enamel just like you use regular embossing powder. If you want to stamp, you can stamp with Versamark or embossing ink and sprinkle that on top. But because we're using molds and we're going to be using it really thick, I'm going to use the melting pot first, and we're just going to pour it into the mold. But some fun things about ultra thick embossing enamel: you can layer this and layer this and layer this on whatever image you're embossing on, and it gets really nice and thick. And once it's dried, you can give it some cracks and then ink over it to give your image like an aged look. So that's just another thing that you can do with your ultra thick embossing enamel. And again, like I said, you can use it just like your regular embossing powder, but we're using so much of it that we're just going to go ahead and melt it in the melting pot. I've got it sitting in there. I dumped quite a bit in there, so it's going to take a little longer to melt, and we got it set. So now with this, you don't have to use the cornstarch or the powder to get an easy release. This is going to pop right out of that mold. And I did use it the first time I did it, and what happened was it picked up some of that powder, so I had that little cloudy look to it. So we're going to switch this around a little bit, let that melt evenly. And in the meantime, again, this is the little frame that I did with the air dry clay. We're not going to work with that today because it takes about 24 hours for that to really cure, but I used white, but air dry clay comes in colors. I've got some red and I've got some brown. Easiest thing to do is use some white, and then that way you can paint it, you can mist it, you can use mica on it, you can embellish that any way that you want to match whatever project that you're working on. But again, it does come in some other colors, and you just kind of press it into your mold, and you can get some really good detail using the air dry clay. All right, now again, like I said, this ultra thick embossing enamel, it does come in a few colors too. So if you want something to look metal, you can use your bronze or your gold. And we're going to go back to our heart. It's pretty dry right now. It's hardened up a little bit. It's still a little warm, which means it's a little soft. So what we're just going to do is release the edges a little bit, and release it just a little bit to make sure it comes out of there. So we're going to pop it out, and then I'm just going to let it sit because it's still a little warm, so it's still a little pliable. You want to make sure that's hardened, so we're just going to let it sit and cool some more, and we'll just come back to it. And if you've got some rough edges, you can just go ahead and pop those off. And as far as cleanup for your mold, this will wipe right off. So just take your cloth, wipe it right off, and you're good to go to use your mold again. All right, now as far as our butterfly, you see it didn't take too long for the beeswax to harden back up. Now just know when you use the beeswax, it's not going to be really hard. It looks like some of our ultra thick embossing enamel is ready to go. So we're going to get our mold ready that we're going to use. and we're going to go ahead and start pouring our ultra thick embossing enamel. And you want to move this around in your mold to make sure that you get even coverage and make sure that you get it in all the spaces of your mold, especially if you're using like a really intricate mold, because you want to get all the detail. I've got enough in here, so we're going to do two. We're going to do that cameo, and we're also going to do the heart. Don't want to waste any of that stuff. And I'm not worried about that. That didn't melt. Just as it's coming down, it's going to melt. That's hot enough to melt that. So we got two molds going. And it's not going to take very long for this to harden either, just a couple of minutes. So we're just going to set this aside and let this harden. And while that's hardening, we're just going to go back to some of our other molds that we've got working. See, the edges of that are already hard. We just need that center to go ahead and harden up. So now we're just going to go back to our butterfly. And what you want to do with the butterfly is you want to release the edges first, and you want to try not to bend that, because it is soft. It doesn't get like solid hard. It stays a little soft and pliable. And so you want to release those edges a little bit as it cools. Now here's one of the ultra thick embossing enamel hearts that I did, and what I did is I colored it with some mica powder. I just dry brushed some on, a little in purple and a little bit in gold, just testing out to see how the mica powders work on that. And I really like the way it looks. It gave it some color, but it's still kind of translucent. Now here's another heart that I did with a regular embossing powder, and I brushed that with some black gesso and then wiped that off, and then put some gold rub and buff on it, and then wiped some of that off. So the black gesso got into the cracks, and then the rub and buff was kind of right on top of it. So I'll show you how I did that. And the other butterfly that I did, I just took some silks paint in ice and just kind of brushed that on, so it's got like a really pretty shimmer to it, not a whole lot of color. And so what we're going to do now is we're just going to take some mica powder and one of the other cameos that I did using the ultra thick embossing enamel and some mica powders. Got some bottle green and some gold here. And we're just going to do, again, the dry brush technique on this. And you just take a paintbrush. See, there's the gold. And we're going to check the bottle green. And you just take a dry paintbrush and you just brush it on, and it adheres. There's the bottle green. Those are the two colors that we used. All right. And you take as little or as much as you want to put on here, depending on how deep you want the color. Yeah, I'm going to start out light, and then you can always go back and add more to it. So there's just a little bit of the green. And now I want to highlight a little bit with some gold. So I'm just going to put a little bit of gold on that flower. And I added a little bit more than I wanted to. So I'm just going to go back over it with some green. Just around the edges until I get it the way I like it. And there you have it. That's easy peasy. Next up, we've got the heart, the red heart with just the regular embossing powder. And I'm going to show you how I did it. I put a little bit of black gesso on my mat. And again, I'm sorry, I was kind of off screen here. It's just black gesso with a little bit of water. I missed it, so I took my brush, dipped it in the water, picked up some black gesso, and now I'm just painting over the heart. And I want to get it all down inside those little cracks and crevices, because that's really where I want the black gesso. And then I took a baby wipe and we're wiping off until I get it the way I want. Yeah, I'm going to wipe off all of it in some places and leave some on in some places. Now I'm going to take some rub and buff and I'm going to put that on my mat, and I'm going to wipe it on, and I'm going to make sure I go around my outside edges too, almost like inking the edges. And then I'm taking a baby wipe and I'm just rubbing it in and rubbing off in some places, again, until I get it the way I like it. And then again with a dry cloth. And then adding a little bit more and just giving it a good rub. And there you have it. All right, now these are completely dry, the ones we just did. So now it's just time to pop them out. You know, see how easy those come out? And again, I didn't put any of the cornstarch or baby powder in those, and they just popped right out. And you can see all the detail. I like using the ultra thick embossing enamel on in the molds. And there's the heart. And I had a little spillage, so just pop it right off, or you can use some scissors and just snip it right off. And there's my heart. All right, now it's time for us to get our butterfly out of here. And like I said, you want to be careful with your butterfly because, again, it doesn't harden. It's a little soft, so you want to bend the mold to pop the butterfly out because you may take a chance on cracking your butterfly. But the good thing about that is you can always put it back in the mold and heat it. It'll melt and it'll go back together, and then just let it dry and pop it back out. All right, for the butterfly, I'm just going to grab some silks and we're just going to brush over it. I've got some teal zircon here, and I'm just going to brush over the wings of the butterfly just to bring out some of the detail in the wings. That's what the silks does once you put it on there. You can see more of the detail, the ridges, the decoration in the wings of the butterfly. You could add glitter to